interview question answer series. In the series, rather than just plain answers, we will discuss what exactly the interviewer is expecting from you based on your experience level and what is the best way to structure your answer. So today we'll start with part 1 for Spring Boot developers with experience 1 to 3 years. The first very basic question is what is Spring Boot and how it is different from Spring Framework. In this, interviewer is checking if you understand why Spring Boot exists, not just its definition. They want to see if you can differentiate it from the plain Spring and appreciate its advantages in the real world development. So to answer this, you should start by explaining the problems with traditional Spring and then introduce Spring Boot as a solution. So this question can be answered like traditional Spring requires a lot of XML configuration and manual bean wiring. Spring Boot simplifies that by offering auto configuration, starter dependencies, and embedded servers. With all these things streamlined, now you can focus purely on business logic implementation. So it is basically Spring plus automation plus convention over configuration. So there is one annotation at the rate Spring Boot application with using which you can just start your entire application without writing a single XML line. Now moving to the next question. What are the main features of Spring Boot? With this, interviewer may be testing if you have actually worked with Spring Boot and know its key features from experience, not just the theory. The best way to answer this question is list the feature briefly but link them to the real use cases. So this question can be answered like the first Spring Boot feature which takes it to the next level is auto configuration. It helps in reducing the boilerplate setup that we used to do in case of Spring. Another important feature is starter dependencies. So Spring Boot provides common use case dependencies as bundles known as starter dependencies. The most used starter dependency is Spring Boot Starter Web Dependency, which includes all the dependencies required for creating web applications or REST API services. Another important feature is inclusion of embedded servers. Now with Spring Boot, there is no need to deploy on external Tomcat. You can run your applications directly with java-jar command. One major feature of Spring Boot is no XML configuration required. We can use annotations and sensible defaults instead of complicated XML configurations. On overall, if you think, Spring Boot makes Spring faster, lighter, and developer friendly. Next question, which can be related to one of these features of Spring Boot is, what is the purpose of Spring Boot starter dependencies? So with this, interviewer wants to see if you understand the dependency management in Spring Boot and how starter simplifies the life as a developer. While answering, you should try to use the real example instead of just definitions. So this question can be answered like starters are the predefined dependency bundles which contains all the required libraries for a specific type of task. For example, if you want to build a web service or a REST endpoint, then you may need to add multiple dependencies as per the requirement. But using Spring Boot Starter, you can simply use Spring Boot Starter Web Dependency as a single dependency. It will bring everything including Spring MVC, Jackson, and Tomcat. So you don't have to manually list tens of libraries. It is basically, we can say, a curated combo meal for the developers. Now let's move to the next question. How does Spring Boot auto configuration work internally? With this, the interviewer wants to check if you have gone beyond using Spring Boot or do you know how it actually works behind the scenes. So you should make sure while you're answering that you should mention the class path scanning and conditional bean configuration. So this question can be answered like auto configuration checks what libraries are present on the class path and configures bean accordingly. For example, if Spring MVC exists in the class path, then Spring Boot automatically set up the dispatcher servlet. You do not have to set it up in XML file like we used to do earlier. This automatically configuring behavior comes from an annotation at the rate enable auto configuration and also the configurations listed inside spring.factories file in meta-inf folder. If you explain it this much, then this gives the interviewer a confidence in your understanding, which is great for your impression in their mind. Now let's move to the next question. What is the role of at the rate Spring Boot application annotation? This annotation is a combination of three different annotations: at the rate configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan. This annotation is used in the main class of Spring Boot application that tells the Spring to automatically configure this application based on the libraries on that particular class path. It also tells Spring Boot to scan the components within the project base package and all of its sub packages. By using this single annotation, you have enabled the auto configuration, component scan, and configuration beans. So it is like the main gate through which your Spring Boot applications start working. Now let's move to the next question. What are Spring Boot profiles and how do you use them? Here the interviewer wants to know if you have managed different environments like dev, test, and prod cleanly. Answer to this question should go like profiles in Spring Boot allows us to define environment specific settings. For example, we can create application-dev.yaml to define the dev specific configuration and application-prod.yaml to define the production specific configuration. To activate which particular profile we want to use, we can use a property which is spring.profile.active, and whatever value we provide, that particular configuration will be activated. This helps keep configuration clean and environment specific. Let's move to the next question. The next question is how do you create a REST API in Spring Boot? So now this is a very important question from a beginner's developer point of view. In this, the interviewer wants to know if you have actually built APIs using Spring Boot and not just read about it. To answer this question, you need to draft your response in a proper sequence of events which will result in a standard API development. This can be answered like first we need to make sure that the required dependencies are added. We need Spring Boot starter web dependency for creating RESTful APIs and embedded Tomcat. We'll definitely have a backend database from where the data will be fetched. So Spring Data JPA and their respective database dependency should also be added. Then we need to add the required database details such as JDBC URL, username, password, and other data source related details in a properties or YAML file. Then to create a REST endpoint, first we need to create a class and annotate it with @REST controller. Then inside this, we need to create different methods and map those methods to appropriate HTTP methods using @getMapping, @postmapping, etc. We will also create service class and annotate it with @service annotation. This class will contain our core business logic. We will also need to create a repository interface and annotate it with @repository. This will be responsible for handling all the database operations. In addition to that, we may also need to create the required entities and DTO classes. By going into this much detail, you confirm the interview that yes, you have actually worked on creating the REST APIs. The next follow-up question could be related to the previous one itself. For example, what are the common HTTP methods and their purpose in RESTful APIs? Now, this is a very common question for 1 to 3 years experienced developers. Here, the interviewer wants to test your understanding of REST principles. So you need to cover the most common methods with their use cases. Answer to this question could be like there are different type of HTTP methods based on their purpose. For example, HTTP GET method is used to retrieve the data from server. Similarly, HTTP POST method is used to create a new resource on the server. And in case we need to update an existing resource either completely or partially, we can use put and patch request respectively. Lastly, to delete a resource from server, we can use HTTP delete method. In Spring Boot, each of the HTTP method have an annotation associated with it. For example, HTTP GET method, we have @getMapping and similar for the other methods as well. Now let's move to the next question. How does Spring Boot handle dependency injection? Here you need to show the interviewer that not only from Spring's perspective, you know what dependency injection is as a design pattern. So you can start with explaining what dependency injection is, and then you can give an example of any work that you have done where beans were injected to another beans by IOC container. Answer to this question could be like dependency injection is a design pattern which helps in implementing the inversion of control design principle. In this, the responsibility of object creation of dependent object is moved out of the class to an external container, which makes things loosely coupled. In Spring Boot, we have Spring IOC container that contains all the Spring managed beans, and whenever any bean is required by another bean, then IOC container will inject that dependent bean. This process is known as dependency injection. Suppose we have a service implementation user service which is required in our user controller. So instead of creating a new object of user service in user controller, we will be using constructor based dependency injection. In this Spring IOC container, when it encounters the requirement of user service while creating the managed bean of user controller, then it automatically injects the already created managed bean of user service from IOC container. Now this reduces the manual new object creation and promotes the loose coupling. Another very famous interview question is, what is the difference between @component, @service and @repository annotation? With this question, the interviewer wants to see if you know the intent behind different stereotypes and not just that they make beans. Answer to this question could be like @component is a generic annotation which will be used for making a class Spring managed bean. It can be mostly used for utility classes. @service annotation on the other hand is used for classes where core business logic is written. And @repository annotation is used for persistent layer, which also adds a database exception translation for better understanding. Now let's move to the next question. How do you connect a Spring Boot application to a database? In this, the interviewer wants to know if you have set up DB connection practically and used JPA. Start answering this in a proper sequence of steps, like first we will add the Spring Data JPA and respective database connector dependency in pom.xml in case we are using Maven. And then we configure application.yaml or properties file with data source details like JDBC URL, username, password, etc. And that's all we need to configure a database connection in Spring Boot, because Spring Boot will auto create data source objects. So we can start creating the required entities and repositories to communicate with the required database tables. Now let's move to the next question. What is the use of application.properties or application.yaml file in Spring Boot? Both of these files are configuration sources. We can store all application configuration in these files, and Spring Boot will read the configuration from these files by default. We can store details such as server.port, DB credentials, logging levels, and even our own custom keys which we'll be using in our core business logic. Spring Boot reads it automatically during the startup without any extra code needed. Okay, so let's move to the next question. How do you handle exceptions in Spring Boot REST APIs? Now, this is also a very important question. Now in Java, it's very simple. Just use try-catch blocks and handle the exceptions. But here the interviewer wants to check if you know the clean and organized error handling in enterprise application setup. You can start answering with a global exception handling in Spring Boot. For that, we can use @controller advice to mark a class as global exception handler, and inside that class we can define multiple methods with @exception handler, where each of these methods will handle that specific exception in a consistent way. Also, we should return the proper HTTP status code. For example, if resource is not found, then it should be 404 not found. If there are some issues with the client request, then it should be 400 bad request. And if something went wrong at the server level, then it should be 5xx error. Now let's move to the next question. What are the different type of bean scopes available in Spring? Now, this is also a very important question and it is mostly asked. To answer this, you just need to name the scope and give them a one-liner explanation. For example, the beans in Spring Boot can have different scopes. A scope of a bean defines when a bean is created and destroyed. We have singleton scope where the bean will have one instance per container, and it is the default scope of beans in Spring. So whenever the container is created, the singleton bean will be created and it will be destroyed with the context itself. We also have prototype scope where every time a new instance is created and returned whenever it is requested. Then we have request scope where a new bean is created per HTTP request. Similar to that, we have session scope where the new bean is created per HTTP session. The last type of scope that we have is application scope. In this, one bean is present per servlet context. We can define the scope of bean using @scope annotation. With this type of response, you can showcase that you know the different scopes, their use cases, and how to set scope for a particular bean in the code as well. Okay, so that's all for today's session. We'll cover some more interview questions in the same way in our upcoming videos. With the new videos, the level of questions and the experience level required will be increasing. So if you find this video useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, let's just keep learning.